Hi, everybody. Christian Brim with Core Group. Very excited to be with you today and do this presentation. I've been thinking about a presentation series, and in this one, we're going to talk more high level, but frankly, I think this is a subject that I could write a few books on. So really would appreciate any questions that you have as I go through. Please stop me. I'm going to try and sprinkle in a lot of personal experience share here to give you some flavor and some real life examples. But do not ask anything that you do not want recorded on the interwebs forever. So with that, I will, I also want to say that I will be following up with all the participants with an email referencing all of these articles, books, and stuff that I mentioned in this. So don't worry about getting them written down. They'll be sent to you. So welcome to Startup to Grow Up, what it takes to grow profitably. So if you ask any business owner, what do you want to do? Grow. That's probably a universal answer. We want to grow our business. Rarely do you hear the term profit. Pardon me, got to turn off my heater. Rarely do you hear profit answered as far as what do you want to do, which in the reality, you want to make more money, not just be bigger. And therein lies the challenge. There's me. There's my email address. Feel free to follow up with any questions that you don't want to ask in today's session. So let's talk about growth stages. And so this concept is one that Daniel Marcos, who is a scaling up advisor down in Texas, came up with. And basically what it does is it takes businesses and talks about their stage based upon two things. One, their intent. Do they intend to grow? But two, then how many employees they have. And so the reason why he used employees as the segregator is because revenue is varies differently, greatly sometimes, depending upon the industry. Multiple countries. He worked with companies internationally. So he said that employees were a better proxy for stage because employees equal complexity. And I think that's a great concept, because that's really the more important thing. And so it's not that these are like bright lines. You might have 6 employees and still fall into that startup category. Whereas, you might have 50 employees and still be grow up. It's really more about other factors around complexity, but just these guidelines don't get real hung up on where exactly you are in that continuum. So if you look at a business, any business, I don't care what you do, what you sell, what you make, there are essentially 3 parts of a business, any business. You have operations. In our business, we call it client service because that's what we do. But operations, delivering the good or service that you are in the business of doing. The second is you have marketing. Marketing and sales are 2 different things, but you have some way to bring in new customers. And the third is finance and administration. So basically keeping track and supporting all of the other functions. Every business has those 3 things. It can be very complex in there, but if you think about it in terms of every business, regardless of their growth stage, are going to have those 3 main components. And think about your business as we go through this in those terms. So scaling up is a process that was developed by the original gangster, Vern Harnish, the growth guy. Many years ago, he wrote a book originally called The Rockefeller Habits, based upon the Rockefeller family. And then he came up with the version 2 of the concept, which is scaling up. And the reason why I bring this up is because you have the 3 components of a business that are universal, But then these principles that kind of act as a operating system for your business apply in every business, regardless of stage. The Daniel Marcos, who is the author of that article talking about these growth stages, was a scaling up coach. And basically it's people, strategy, execution, and cash. Those are the four things. We don't use scaling up in our business, but I'm very familiar with it. We use it in our Entrepreneurs Organization Accelerator program. So I'm very familiar with the concepts, but and I've used parts of it. So it's very good. I've read both books and I highly recommend the book. The problem is that, in my opinion, that scaling up is probably a little too much for most small businesses. It's very, what's the word I'm looking for? It requires a lot of deep thinking, if you will, not necessarily things that you can just implement in your business, but the concepts are very sound. And as a matter of fact, there was a guy by the name of Gino Wickman that was a scaling up advisor. And he kind of did his own thing. It's called Entrepreneurs Operating System, EOS, and that's what we use in our business as our kind of our operating system. And basically they're the same concepts. He's got it laid out differently, but it's the same principles that you're going to find in Rockefeller Habits and Scaling Up. And in fact, if you look at the two of them together, you'll see things like, okay, people, strategy, vision, execution, traction, issues, so they're very similar. But in my mind, EOS has been dumbed down for people like me and small businesses, so it's easier to implement. And so I say all this before we go into the different stages, because two things I want you to take away. One is that you have three main components of your business. I don't care what business you're in or what size you are. And two, when you get to a certain level of complexity, you're going to need some type of operating system to move forward. And in our case, it came at probably about 20 employees. And it was basically a situation where I could no longer manage directly all of the people doing all of the work, and therefore couldn't keep everybody on the same page moving towards the same goal. And that's when the complexity of your organization grows, and that's generally number of people, eventually you're going to have to implement something like this, like EOS or Scaling Up, to get that traction. All right, so let's start with the first, startup. Startup, as it's defined, is 1 to 5 employees. It doesn't have anything to do with your time in business. You could be in business for 10 years and be a startup in this model. So most people think of startup as I'm a new business. That's not the case. So when it comes to startup, when we started, we actually bought a franchise. There was an accounting franchise, if you believe it, in 1997. And so we had a lot of systems that already came built into the franchise. And that's not the case with most businesses. Most businesses that start out don't have processes and don't have systems built in. They have to figure it out. That's one of the benefits of a franchise, whether it's a Sonic or Express Personnel. It gives you some of those pre-made things in the business to accelerate that growth. But in the startup phase, in our situation, there was me and my wife. We didn't have an employee. And it was all about making enough money to stay in business. It's just that simple. So when you're in the startup phase, you're looking at this break-even concept. How do I get enough money to cover first my fixed costs? I've got my rent, my phone, I've got, the electricity, whatever that is, that are my fixed costs. How do I get enough revenue to offset that so I'm not going backwards? And then it's about getting that revenue up to a break even with the profit. And I'll give you an example here in a minute. So the growth metric that you focus on in the startup is break even. The break even is simply taking the amount of expense that you're trying to cover and offsetting it with revenue. You're also going to be proving the concept. Is the business viable? Can you survive? Some businesses stay in the startup stage for a long time. And that's okay. Maybe it takes a while to figure out. But one of the things that I've seen so many times in smaller businesses in this space is there's not enough paid to the owner. And that causes a couple of different problems. One is you're not making any money personally, right? I mean, that's a big deal. The second is that even when the business starts breaking even and has some cash flow and therefore some profit, but the owner's not paying themselves, there's not a real clear reflection of what the business is. All right. And what I mean by that is an owner should be paid as a wage the value of what their work is. So in other words, if you were going to replace yourself in the business, what would you have to pay somebody to do what you do in the business? If you don't provide for that by paying yourself, you get some really wonky numbers, and you may be in a situation where your business isn't as profitable as you think it is. It isn't as viable as you think it is. It may even be a situation where if you were to have to replace yourself, the business doesn't make any money. And therefore you don't really have a business. You just have a very low paying job. The second thing is that, and I've seen this, there are hundreds of business owners that I've seen out there that struggle in essentially what is a self-employed situation. They could go make more money, have a lot less stress, doing whatever it is they do for someone else as an employee. Paying yourself and putting that into your numbers is a way to avoid the disruption of that information. I'm going to skip over into my notes, make sure I didn't miss anything. Couple of books I would recommend before I go on to the example. Two books that I loved and helped me a lot. The first was Rich Dad, Poor Dad. And it's really about the mindset of what a business owner is versus an employee, versus wealthy versus a poor mindset, if you will, not necessarily impoverished. But it's a great book. Robert Kiyosaki, highly recommend it. The second book is Gerber's E-Myth, or E-Myth Revisited. He's republished it a couple of different times. But in that book, Gerber talks again about not being self-employed, about building a business. And that's really the mindset in the startup space is you don't want a job. Most people don't want a job. They want to build a business. If you want a job and you want to be living in that space, just understand you're self-employed. It's not a business. You are an independent contractor, and you are the business, and that's a completely different thing. And there's nothing wrong with that, but make sure you understand that if you want to progress into these stages, you've got to be building a business, not a self-employed. All right. Now, here's my example. So I said the first benchmark is break even for fixed costs. So in my example, I don't know if this is accurate or not, but I'm going to say that our fixed costs when we started out were $60,000. Our variable costs, I guessed at this is probably not accurate, but essentially it's what are the incremental costs involved in delivering the service or good. So if you're in a manufacturing environment, you know how much it costs to build a widget. If you are in the service business, you know how much your labor cost is to do the service. So it's saying that for every dollar that I bring in revenue, it costs me 60 cents to provide that good or service. That equates to gross margin of 40%. That's just the reciprocal of that number. So if I take the fixed cost and I divide it by the 40%, I end up with a break even of 150,000. This just means I'm not going backwards. It does not mean that I'm making any money. And if you don't believe me, you can do the math. 150,000 times 40% is 60,000. So you're at break even, no gain, no loss. But then the next step would be to do this target profit. And I think initially it should be what the owner's wage should be. And so I put in 75,000 as what I needed to live on at that age. And I do that calculation again. I take the 60 of fixed costs, the 75, I've got 135,000 now. I divide that by the 40% and I get a break even of $338,000. So this is the example of the metric that you want to use in that startup space. So the next iteration, going up the ladder, is grow up, and that's defined as 6 to 15 employees. Again, don't get hung up on the number of employees. In this space, the key thing is replacing yourself for functions, being able to delegate. One of the hardest things for me to deal with in this space was turning over work, delivery of a service, or, if you make widgets, you stop doing the manufacturing, is that you then are dependent upon others to do things for you, and you have to live with the consequences of that. And from a personal growth standpoint, that's a huge thing. I have seen business owners that never get beyond that. They can never get to a point where they can let someone else do it, know that they're going to do it differently than they are. They're going to have maybe not the same outcome. Maybe they just simply aren't as good as the owner at whatever it is that they do. But they have to be able to get past that, because if they don't, it's self-employed. It's a one-man show. I can't go beyond that. So that's the real key focus in the grow up, is replacing yourself with others to do the key functions. Only 4% of businesses ever reach $1 million in revenue. And that's probably, depending upon your industry, where you're going to end up crossing the $1 million threshold. So understand that this is rarefied air, okay? If you're going to get to this point, you're going to be special as a business owner. I'm not saying that you can't. I'm not saying anybody can't. I'm just saying that it's a place where a lot of businesses stall. Conversely, there's a lot of people that end up in this space and are very profitable, and they never grow any further, and that's perfectly fine. The growth metric we focus on here is gross margin. So again, going back to our example of 40%, we want to focus on that number, not the top line number, and adding the right revenue. I can give you an example. When we were in this space, largest client we'd ever had came to us. It's probably at that time, 8, 9, 10 times our average client size. But when we did the math after we had served that client for about 6 months, we realized that we were making very little money on that. And our margin on that was a lot less than the ones that our bread and butter, if you will. And that is a trap that I think virtually every business owner gets into at some point in time, is they see the shiny big dollar contract or revenue size, but they don't really make any money on it. So adding the right revenue, that means you got to dig deep and go into your customers and see, am I really making money on this client? Or am I really just covering costs and doing a lot of work for nothing? The third thing is systematizing. So along with replacing yourself, if you're going to tell someone else to do what you do, whether that's a service or manufacturing a product, and you want someone else to do it, you need to tell them how to do it. And the best way to do that is to create a system or a process for them to do that. The books that I would recommend in here are Good to Great by Jim Collins, excellent book, and Traction by the aforementioned Gino Wickman that came up with EOS. Both of those are great books for people in this grow up space. It could be a point, like I mentioned a little bit earlier, that this is where you're most profitable ever. I know that to be true for us because as we tried to grow, our gross margin didn't increase, and therefore our bottom line didn't increase. And so what essentially happens is you're just doing more work for the same amount of money, and that doesn't make any sense to anybody. But that's a trap that a lot of business owners end up in. So I want to give you an example of if you're going into your customers and trying to figure out who is the right revenue. Give you 3 examples. So customer A brings in $25,000. After you pay your costs, it's 10 grand. It's what you make on them. Customer B, 30,000 in revenue, 10,000 in margin. Ask a simple question. Which of those two is the better client or better customer? Well, the answer is A, because you're doing less work ostensibly, or you're having to sell less. Whatever it is, you're having to do less work by $5,000 to get the same amount of money. Okay, that's the kind of analysis that you need to be going into. But let me throw this hitch in here, which is something that happens a lot. Is you have this customer C that you have a lot of revenue on, 100,000, but your gross margin's only 15. Now, if you look at a percentage standpoint, this one's this is going to be one of those you say, well, I got to get rid of these guys. I'm not making enough money. The problem is what happens if that revenue and that customer pays for an employee, right? Maybe it's a specific line of business that you do. And it's not real profitable, but it's something that this customer pays for that employee, and then you can use that employee to help other customers and serve other customers. I say that because if you're an accountant like me and you're coming into a business and you're doing this analysis, you look at things at a much more granular level, and you would pick up on this because it would be, well, that employee's cost is actually needed to be allocated to all the customers, not just that one customer. But for you as a business owner that's not a trained accountant, you may get kind of blindsided by that when you may say, well, that we don't make any money on that customer, but we really need that employee. And then really kind of asking the question, do we need to be offering that service? That's the whole right revenue. I can tell you one of the things that really screwed us up over the years was, like I said, when we started, we were franchised and we had very specific systems, very specific processes. And we knew how to do what we did very well. This was pre-QuickBooks. This was just when Quicken came out, for instance. And you know what happened over the next 10, 15 years? Well, all this technology changed. All of the needs and expectations of our customers changed. And what we ended up with was what I call scope creep. We ended up doing a lot more types of things for customers. In other words, our scope of work just creeped and kept growing and growing. That's a real problem when you start talking about margin, and it really comes into play when you're talking about scaling up, which is the next stage of growth. So scaling up is 16 to 100 employees. I didn't go over 100. There is a fourth segment you can read in the article, but that's not a small business, so I just excluded it. But know that it's there. So in scaling up, it's you have to still consider the margin. You still have to consider the same things you did in Grow Up, but now it becomes a question of cash flow. Why does it turn into terms of cash flow? Well, it takes money to grow. You either have to buy more inventory, hire more people, have more space. You have costs of acquisition and bringing in customers. And so therefore, when you're growing in that scale up and continue up that plane, you have to consider how you're going to fund it. And that drives the pace of growth, right? It's not just that you're growing, it's how fast are you growing. If you have a higher gross margin, you can grow faster. So you look at a manufacturing environment where their gross margin may only be 30%. They can't grow as fast as a service business that say has a 50% margin. And a service business can't grow as fast as, say, a software company that has a 90% margin, because it doesn't really cost them anything to add a user to the software. It's pretty much straight to the bottom line. So again, the higher your gross margin is, the faster you can grow. More right revenue. So in Grow Up, we were talking about, well, we need to really look at that margin and make sure that we're not bringing on customers just for that top line dollar. We want to focus on the gross margin. In scaling up, you've got to go even tighter. And here's why. If you're going to grow, you have to do two things. Everything has to be systematized, and you have to be real clear on your marketing. It's not enough to just do things well. You can be really good at what you do, but to take this to the scale up level and really grow beyond that, you've got to be hyper focused on who it is that you serve and what it is, the problem that you're solving for them. Vern, in his book, Scaling Up, uses the example of this dishwashing company. I don't remember the name. It's a commercial dishwashing application or a system. I say system because it's not just the washer, it's the water filtration and the chemicals. They sell a whole system. And their delivery, what problem they solve is dishware that looks clean. And so their target market are high-end restaurants and hotels. And so they design not just a dishwasher, but a whole system, a whole solution to that problem. But here's what happened. They have 90% market share. It's not a question of when, they go and they're going to open another hotel. They don't go get bids. They don't quote. They know exactly who they're calling. I want this in my restaurant. That's more right revenue. Knowing exactly who it is that you are targeting and providing a solution for, and saying no to everybody else. And I mean everybody else, because everybody else that you bring in is just a drain on your ability to serve that right customer. Books I'd recommend in this space. Scaling Up, aforementioned. 5 Dysfunctions of a Team by Lencioni. Short book, great book. I highly recommend it. It's as you get into this space, you're going to be dealing with obviously more people, and being able to function as a team is critical. Your mindset here is, and what my mindset had to shift from, so we're currently in the scale up, but when moving from Grow Up to Scale Up, what I had to change in my mind was this idea that I had to do it all myself, or I had to drive all of this myself, to one where I have a great team. I've laid out the vision, and they figure out how to get there. An example, this year we have, or we're still in the process of completely redoing all of the software that we use in the organization. And I mean everything. I think the only thing that we're still using when it's all done, said and done, is Office, Outlook and those things. But here's the deal. I didn't pick any of it. I didn't even give direction to any of it. My team knew what we were trying to accomplish. And so they had an idea of the vision and what those parameters needed to be. And then they went out and figured it out. And I think that's what's so exciting to me as an owner, is seeing that the success doesn't have to be dependent upon me. I mean, frankly, that's kind of an egotist thing to think that, well, if it's going to happen, I got to make it happen. And if you do have that mindset and can't get beyond that mindset, which I did for a long time, you're going to be stuck at the grow up. I mean, that's just the reality. Until you can involve a team of people to execute on your vision, you can't go into the scale up and be successful. So inspiring others to that vision and letting them solve the problems. So come to the point of the program where we have Q&As. So if you got a question, pop it into the question and answer, and I will be happy to answer it. If not, I will conclude. I will send you all copies of the links to the books and the articles that I mentioned. And if you have any questions, feel free to ping me back. Thank you all for coming. As we say in Core Land, we shake, wave. Did I say do the shake? We wave until the camera's off. Wait, I'll see if I can figure it out. Bye.